I hope you're doing well. How are you doing? Given the week that we've had, what a strange, frightening, and still a confusing week that we've had. It was bad enough trying to kick 2020 out the door and come into 2021 with some hope, and then this happens, right? So here's what happened on Wednesday as I was finishing up my sermon. It was Epiphany, the day in which the Christ child is illuminated, is revealed to the wise men as they're searching out in the wilderness. And it was the 6th, and it was about midday, about 1 o'clock. I was about to sit down and record the message, and I saw in my text a phone message. And so I on my phone I saw a text message, so I followed back. It said Tom ! I called him. I texted back and I said, "What?" Didn't know what they meant. And then they texted back, "Are you doing okay?" ! I had no idea what they were talking about. I said, "Why?" They texted back, "Aren't you watching the news?" ! I turned on the screen, and of course, like you, the rest of my day, my evening, was upended. And it so upended my day and my sort of orientation to my life, literally, that I ended up rewriting the message and thinking through some other thoughts that I want to bring to you this morning. And I hope you find them helpful for where you are right now. But I can tell you it was so disorienting to me that I found myself in a very strange place for about a day and a half. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. And so what I'm going to look at is the series that I'm calling The Uncertain Tour. Happy New Year, The Uncertain Tour. Seems a little bit ironic, I suppose. No pun intended, given the song that we just heard by Alanis Morissette. Incidentally, what she was describing weren't really ironies, were they? They were more like tragedies. Except the ironic part might be that in the midst of those tragedies, she was still finding a way to experience some kind of joy, some kind of laughter, some kind of sense of humor about it all. And that's what I want to offer us today as well, with where we are. So here's what we're going to look at. Tom is disoriented and drowning again. Angry at who or whom? Designated listeners, everyone should have one. God is a river. Swimming with sea turtles. The greatest challenge to uncertainty is. And then a forgetful law of physics, which shouldn't be forgotten. And then going home by another way. That's what we're going to look at today. So I found myself thinking back, it hit me at this point where I was thinking, how can this be? It just overwhelmed me with such anxiety and fear that I found myself lashing out at Trump and at these extremist supporters, and really at supporters in general that I knew, and even at friends. I just found myself in a place that surprised me. I was saying things that I would not normally say. I just had been taken by surprise with all of this, and I was getting into a darker and darker place, and I knew it. And I was reminded of this experience that I'd had where I didn't know what the next right thing to do would be. Have you been in one of those places before where there was so much chaos, it was so disorienting, that even for just a moment, you weren't sure what the next thing would be? That even you weren't even sure if there was a next thing to do. So when I was about 28 years ago, when I was snorkeling with my son, Tim, who was 9 at the time, we found ourselves in a place where we had been snorkeling without our life vests. We were with an inexperienced guide down in Belize, and we were snorkeling along the reef, and we wanted to be able to dive down into the water, so we'd gone in without vests. Well, we shouldn't have, but there we were. And what we didn't know is that we were close to a cut in the reef where the water was deeper so that larger ships could come in. And you don't even have to be that close to a cut in the reef to begin to be caught in the current, in the outgoing current. And before we knew it, we were caught up in this current that was moving us through the cut and out into the open sea. And when I looked up, it hadn't been but just a minute or two, but when I looked up, we were a good 100 yards away from our little boat and our guide. And what I didn't realize and found out later, I couldn't find him. I was yelling, but I couldn't see him. It was because he had taken a nap. So there we were without life vests, and we were drifting out into the open sea and had gotten into a panic. We could not swim against this current to get over towards the reef, which was about 100 feet away. And at least if we got close, we could grab hold of the rocks, or we could at least stand up a bit. But we couldn't get there. And Tim, 9 years old, was in a panic, a full-on panic. He was flailing, he was screaming, he was just out of control, which was beginning to overwhelm me. I was having a hard time finding balance, finding some sense of focus. And at one point, I was so panicked and anxious, and really I just kind of thought, okay, this is it, honestly, that I did something that I surprised even me. I grabbed him, it was almost instinctively. I grabbed him by the face, stared him right in the face and said, "Tim!" And I pointed, I said, "Look at that." And I didn't know what I was pointing at, the island, I don't know. I just pointed, and he looked. He caught his, he sort of had that deer in headlights look. It caught him off guard for just enough time that he stopped screaming, and he looked, and it gave me a chance to get him up out of the water so he could kind of breathe, and it gave me a chance to see something I hadn't seen before. But about 30 or 40 feet from us was one of those light buoys, one of those warning buoys that warned about the reef, a reef warning buoy. And it warned boats that were coming in that the reef was probably another 100 feet away, so steer clear of that. It was only about 30 feet from us. I just hadn't seen it. And I said, "Tim, we can get there." And we swam to it. It took a little bit of strength still. And we got there, caught our breath, and we're just clinging on to it. And soon enough, another little tour boat, another little boat of snorkelers saw us and came over and got us. And a long story, we dealt with the other guy. Man, that's a whole different story. But the point, I was surprised that came to mind. In a way, I was surprised. Another way, I wasn't, because literally I was in that kind of place where I was overwhelmed, where I found myself not knowing what the next thing to do should be. And St. John of the Cross calls that a dark night of the soul. When we find ourselves in this dark place, unfamiliar place, but so unfamiliar and uncertain that we're kind of moorless. We're kind of unmoored. We don't know and rudderless. We don't know what the next thing should be, perhaps. And so what I was doing, of course, what we all do in a place of fear like that, is we lash out, we get angry, we kind of react a little bit irrationally, a little bit. And I was kind of lashing out at the Trump supporters. I was lashing out at people I know who are Trump supporters. I was lashing out at family members who I know that are Trump supporters. I was just freewheeling, lashing out at people and joining in these text groups. And it was something so uncharacteristic, it took me by surprise. In fact, I found myself apologizing to some folks later on. I just was in one of these out of control kind of spirals, kind of almost a full-on panic. And so when I got home, it was dark, and I decided the best thing to do is take a walk. So I lashed out at the universe, lashed out at God. Why did you bring all these stupid, angry, mean people into our world? And of course, I'm just lashing out. But you got to do it. You got to lash out at somebody. Best lash out at God. The Psalms have given us some good examples of that. And so when I got back to the house, I was at a place where I could talk to Linda. And here's what I want to suggest. Everybody should have a designated listener. A designated listener is somebody whose sole purpose in these kinds of situations is just to listen. Non-judgmentally, no presumptions, not there to fix anything, just there to let you get it out, right? Get it out there. And maybe in the process, they might have a quote. They might have a moment they can sort of say, well, let's just have a meditation. Just a moment or something to offer, maybe a story or an image, but nothing judgmental and certainly nothing trying to fix it. You just need to get it out sometimes. Who's your designated listener, right? It may be your partner, it may be your spouse, maybe a best friend, and maybe a therapist. Linda knows that I'm not the best designated listener for her, but she was great for me. And she was great the other night as I just kind of let these things roll out. She reminded me of this interesting fact that I hadn't really remembered. She said, there was this study that she said, I remembered reading, she said, where they found that the success of a relationship is directly related, it can be gauged and predicted by the degree of defensiveness or judgment in the individuals. The success or the depth of a relationship can be gauged by the level of defensiveness or judgment in those individuals in that relationship. Now, I thought that was a strange thing to say at first, a little bit more like something I might say to her, kind of unrelated, a non sequitur in the conversation. But then I started thinking about it, and I smiled and I said, put another way, you could probably gauge the happiness and joy of an individual's relationship with the world around them, whether that be with themselves, with their life in general, with their relationship at work, or with their partner. You could gauge the happiness or the joy that they have based on their level of defensiveness in general. Do they tend to be defensive people? Do they tend to cling to presumptions or judgment? In other words, the more that I define someone as my enemy or my anxiety, or that brings about fear, the more I judge others, the more presumptions or ideas that I cling to, then the more likely I'm going to be less happy. The more likely I'm going to have trouble finding a sense of contentment. And I asked Brad to sing this song to kind of bring some light to that idea. Thank you, Brad, for that song. And thank you, Peter Mayer, for those lyrics. That's such a beautiful song. It speaks to something deeply authentic about how we relate to uncertainty. The lyrics of that song just spoke to where I was on Wednesday. I don't know if it speaks to you, but it definitely was where I was, and I think a lot of us were. This ever-shifting water that we find ourselves in the river of life. We're swimming, we're seeking comfort. This past year of uncertainty, where do we find things we can cling to, right? The stones that can hold us fast, that can anchor us when things around us seem shaky, when life seems upended. And what the epiphany of Christ in the world, what the revelation, the incarnation of the divine in our midst is really saying, I think, is that in uncertain times, the very ground of our being is the rock we connect with. But that ground of our being is interrelated with all of life, with everyone. So relating to that requires a great deal more attention. It requires not so much comfort and familiarity as comfort in uncertainty. That's a hard place to go. That's a hard place to get. But that's what the song suggests. And so he says, from the river and its dangers, I proclaim my rock divine. I prayed for it to protect me, and the rock replied, God is a river, not just a stone. God is wild and raging rapids. God's a slow meandering flow. There's this, in the midst of uncertainty, there is something to learning to let go of what we presume in order to experience something more deeply. As Linda shared with me, our relationships can grow deeper and richer. Our relationship with life, when we let go of the presumptions or the defensiveness or the rightness we bring to the moment. That's the challenge, I think, in times of uncertainty. So thanks again, Brad, for singing that song and sharing that with us. What's the greatest challenge to uncertainty, right? It's that longing for certainty. And if I shared anything with you, I would say this, that I want you to remember. Our litmus test for knowing what the next decision should be, or the right thing to do, or what's right versus what's wrong, our litmus test for that should not be fear. Fear is not a good litmus test for any choice or decision, unless it's an immediate danger, right? An immediate, imminent danger. But even then, fear drives us toward a place of immobility, of inaction, of inability to act right. So I would say that in all of our dealings with life and all of our relationships, the challenge for us is to develop a practice of being present with what is scary. Present enough to begin to see what else is there. And begin to see, again, that connection at the ground of our being. The connection of love at the ground of our being. And that's really what the Epiphany is to me, as I see it, is this reality of God at the heart of all things. And born or evidenced when the wise men discover the baby, the infant Jesus. I mean, what a contrast. Here is this reality that's like so much of our history, our human history. War and conflict, power and authoritarianism as the way of life. And sort of just we take it for granted. We go to war. It's just the way to be in life. And so we see violence acted out all the time as the way to solve problems. But Jesus is born into this reality as a different way. A way of peace, a way of connection, a way of relationship, a way of inclusiveness, a way of understanding and compassionate curiosity, if you will. And so the wise men, when they see that, they're changed too. As the story says, they go home by another way. They don't go back to that same way of relating to the world. It's a powerful narrative that I think challenges us to explore this way of looking at uncertainty, that our litmus test for dealing with uncertainty shouldn't be fear. Fear shouldn't be the way in which we decide what to do next, right? Instead, being present to where we are, stopping long enough to see what else is there. Even in the midst of the chaos, there's something else there, but we can't see it because we're overwhelmed, we're afraid. And how do we practice that? How do we get grounded? Well, a friend of mine shared this story with me, another swimming story. She said she was swimming in Hawaii, and she was swimming off the beach about, 50 yards, 25 yards out there. And it wasn't too deep, but she was swimming when she noticed some sea turtles. And as she watched them, she was fascinated by them. They were swimming out away from the beach. So she tried to keep up with them so she could watch. But what she noticed was they were moving further and further away from her pretty fast. And she looked at me and she said, they were sea turtles. They're slow, they're big. But there they were with their huge fin-like legs just swimming out into the ocean. And I said, well, they are adapted for water, so they're probably moving faster than you are on the surface. She said, that wasn't what it was. I just struggled harder and harder and found that I was making less and less progress. And they were moving on in spite of the waves. She said, the next day when I went out again, I happened to see one sea turtle. And as I swam up behind it, I noticed what it was doing. I just stopped. I stood there and I looked in the water and I noticed what it was doing. When the wave would come in against it, the sea turtle would swim just enough to keep itself stationary. It moved its fins just enough to stay in one place, but not so much to exhaust itself. Then when the water went back out, it began to swim quickly and fast, taking advantage of the outgoing current. And then as it would come back, it would just hold its position. When the water went out, it would continue to swim. I started doing the same thing, she said, and it was like this epiphanal moment. Suddenly I realized, how often do I spend swimming against the current in my relationships with life, in my relationships at work, in my relationship with myself, and with what I feel like my purpose of being here in the world? How often do I swim against the current as opposed to being present enough to see how the current works? That's the challenge that we find ourselves in. And I have to admit that I think a lot of us are finding that difficult. I don't know about you, but to answer this question for me, just honestly reflect here. How many of you in the last few months have found yourself thinking, I need to go in the other room, pick something up, get something and come back? You get in the other room immediately, and then as soon as you get there, you've forgotten why you've gone in there and what you were to get. Or honestly, how many of you have started your shower and forgotten to take it? You start, okay, I don't think it's just me. You start the water and you just go do something else, and then you forgot that you started a shower. Or even worse, okay, this may just be me, but you've made your lunch and then you forgot to eat it. Okay, seriously, in the last several weeks, I have pulled up to green lights and someone has gone flying through in their car, passing through the red light, even after 5, 6, 7 seconds, 10 seconds, as if it wasn't there. I just stop now at green lights because people pass through them. I don't think it's because they're arrogant or because they're just boldly ignoring everybody else. I don't think they're paying attention. I don't think they know what's going on. I've pulled up at stop signs way ahead of other cars, the same thing. I've been in lanes in the middle of the street, in the boulevard, at a stop sign or at a red light. And when it turns green, the car on my right, as if I'm not there, turns left, as if nobody else is around. Linda reminds me to honk my horn so that they know that there's people there. But literally, this is happening more than it's ever happened before. I just wonder, has this happened to you? Are we getting more and more disoriented? Or is it we're just not paying that much attention? I would want to say that what the Epiphany invites us, what the story of the Epiphany invites us to do, is to begin to look for that presence of the holy, that presence of the possibility of love, of the redemptive possibilities in all of our moments, especially in times of uncertainty. But to get there, we have to be willing, as Linda was reminding me, to let go of the defensiveness, to let go of the presumptions. To find the deeper relationship, we have to be willing to come to it with more openness. What we talked about in Advent, the confidence and the courage, the curiosity, in order to find the connection. That has to be our spiritual practice in this time, and it has to be something we're doing on a regular basis because we are becoming disoriented to the reality around us. At least that's what I'm worried about. That we're not paying attention so that even the things that seem obvious, like a crowd of angry people, like a whole population of people angry, that even there we're not really paying attention. It seems obvious to me that we're looking for certainty when we should be cultivating uncertainty. So for the next couple of weeks, that's what we'll do. We'll look at uncertainty and we'll play around with ways that we cultivate it. But I want to leave you with this last idea. When I went to Uncertain, Texas, because a librarian had invited me to go out there to their library, joked with me. You can read the blog and find out the whole story. But when I finally got out there and met some of the people out there, some stories I'll tell next week, but one of the things that I discovered was this funny thing that one of the guys said in the tackle shop there, because it's right there on Caddo Lake, those of you who know where Uncertain is. But he said something funny that I thought, you don't realize, or maybe he did, just how mystical and profound a statement it was. I said, you'd hardly know this place was here. And he'd say, you pretty much have to get lost to find it. I think that's what we have as an opportunity in this time of Epiphany, is to begin to get lost enough to find the beauty even in the most uncertain times. Amen.